do benefit from this economic relationship with China. But at the same time, we should be very clear-eyed that what happens in the Indo-Pacific region, and here I'm thinking across the Taiwan Straits, friction or kinetic conflict across the Taiwan Straits would affect technology supply chains, semiconductor supply chains that employ hundreds of thousands of Canadians.
Welcome to another installment of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. For this episode, we welcome back Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the International Christian University of Tokyo. We discussed Canada's recently released Indo-Pacific policy. Nagy described its strengths and weaknesses, upcoming challenges and opportunities. Nagy also discussed Canada's relationship with ASEAN, strengthening ties with the region, how the region perceives Canada, and cultivating better trade relations with Japan and South Korea. We also discussed how Canada will manage its relationship with China going forward, as well as areas of potential collaboration. Stephen, wonderful to have you back on the program. Thanks for joining me today. Here's my first question for you. What is your initial impression of the newly revealed Indo-Pacific strategy? Are there areas that could be improved? And is there anything new in the document that has not been articulated yet?
First, I really applaud the Global Affairs team and all the people that put together this strategy. It's comprehensive. It clearly puts China at front and center of how Canada should be thinking about the Indo-Pacific. And what I think is important is that it puts China back in the Indo-Pacific rather than China being the Indo-Pacific. Second, it talks about core partners to achieve Canada's core interests within the region. China as an adversary, but also an important partner to dealing with climate change, non-traditional security issues. It talks about Japan and Korea as being critical partners to promoting a rules-based order within the region and dealing with challenges in sea lines of communication, as well as with North Korea, but also trade and other areas. It talks about the importance of ASEAN centrality and how Canada needs to work with regional institutions such as the ASEAN +3 or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to engage within the region. So I think these are real strengths, and if we're going to engage in the Indo-Pacific region, we have to clearly identify those partners that can be used as a bridge to develop a sustainable, meaningful, and I think active presence within the region. I think another important takeaway was there was a strong connection between domestic politics in the Canadian context and some of the areas of focus. So here I'm thinking about First Nations reconciliation. I'm thinking about diversity policies and inclusive development. And lastly, I'm thinking about environmental policy. And we see these really as important pillars in how Canada is going to engage in the Indo-Pacific. First, working with Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia, to try and engage in First Nations cooperation and dealing with First Nations reconciliation. These are themes that resonate with the Canadian domestic politics, but they are also important themes in building transnational partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. In terms of environment, there's a strong language and strong commitments to combating climate change with partners. And in terms of diversity, we see that the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy champions human rights, gender, and LGBT alpha issues in the region, which I think are consistent with the Trudeau government's actions at home. So these are a few take-homes that I have, and I think that we can talk about some of the challenges in the agreement as well. So as I look at the document and the I guess the rollout of the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think that it has been, in terms of timing, has been somewhat problematic. I think that it would have been useful to release the document prior to the November summit retreat to allow Prime Minister Trudeau to come to the region with his foreign policy team to talk about what Canada wants to do in the region while they were here. So I think that this is probably would have been difficult, but I think that this would have given Prime Minister Trudeau and Melanie Joly and the other foreign policy members really the ability to speak to their counterparts and talk about Canada's sustained interest in the region and why, based on a solid document. Second, I think that it would have been useful to identify many think tanks in Canada as the tools to implement Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. So here I'm thinking about not only the Asia-Pacific Foundation, which is an important organization that does good work, but also the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Canadian International Council, as well as other think tanks to start and have a diversity of engagement within the region. Why is that important? Is that we want to not be in an echo chamber about a particular view about the Indo-Pacific. We want to have many different thinkers engaging in the region. I think this is perhaps a shortcoming. It's not including a variety of think tanks as the tools of implementation. Third, and I think that this is really important for us to be thinking about, is what does the region expect of Canada, and what can Canada bring to the region that is something that really the region wants. And here, I think the security side is great. The trade side is great. I do think climate change and identifying non-traditional security issues is really good. I do think that we will be challenged in terms of the promotion of some of the more progressive sides of the Indo-Pacific strategy within the region. Not because they are bad for the Canadian context, but I don't think countries in this part of the world really look at these as priorities for their foreign policy and thinking about the evolution of the Indo-Pacific.
We recently spoke with Jonathan Berkshire Miller, who said that we need to make sure we consult ASEAN nations more and not simply prescribe them what we want to contribute. What do you think about this? Could you describe some challenges we may encounter as we seek to strengthen our ties with ASEAN, along with how we are perceived in the region?
Well, I think Jonathan's right in that we can't be just show up at the door and say, ASEAN, you should do this, you should do that. We need to actually find ways to cooperate with them. Now, if we look at ASEAN's priorities, their priorities include infrastructure and connectivity. They include trying to find a code of conduct in the South China Sea. They include prioritizing ASEAN centrality in terms of economic integration, and as well as how the region is moving forward. So the question for Canada, talking to ASEAN members, is how can we work with them and support some of these initiatives? Now, we do already with 1.5 track dialogue. So Canada last year, for example, worked with the UK and France and other countries to hold, I think it's the 13th South China Seas Conference. And this was meant to create some opportunities for dialogue about how to move forward on the South China Sea issue. More of this would be helpful. I think Canada could provide legal training to help ASEAN countries better negotiate some of the challenges of negotiating a code of conduct, but also to have a better understanding of international law and how they can use it, as the Filipinos did back in 2016, to fight at the international court level to secure their interests in the South China Sea. So I think these are great initiatives that Canada can engage in. I do think Canada has a place for health infrastructure in ASEAN and helping them build the health infrastructure that can deal with not only the current pandemic, but the next pandemic and the next pandemic. I do also think that Canada has a strong role in helping mitigate climate change and deal with some of the real challenges in terms of a more difficult environment within Southeast Asia as global temperatures increase. So there's a lot on the table there, and Canada needs to talk to ASEAN countries and talk to ASEAN and see where they align and where Canada can add value to some of ASEAN's interests. And I think those are some areas that we could focus on.
You've mentioned that we have an abundance of energy resources and critical minerals for countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. However, you also said that Ottawa needs to consider the impact climate change has had on the Indo-Pacific. With that said, how can Canada balance helping meeting the region's demand for natural resources while helping it transition to renewable energy?
So yeah, we did talk last time about Canada being a reliable and stable supplier of energy and critical minerals to the region's economies. And why I mentioned that is that we have those resources, we are reliable, and we have many like-minded friends within the region. And importantly, we could benefit economically. So I think that this could have been put more front and center in terms of how Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy would be important for the region, and it would be welcomed by the region. Now, can we encourage them to have more, I guess, environmentally sustainable forms of energy consumption? Well, yes, and I think that when we look at some of the initiatives that Canada is offering to the region, that there is certainly space to do that. And I just wrote something for the Japan Times, actually, that came out yesterday that talked specifically about that, where Canada is talking about using its renewable energy resources in the region to export some of its technologies, and using those technologies. The hope is that they could reshape the region's economy, and of course ensure that Canadians businesses benefit from being engaged in the region. Moving forward, I think that Canada should also use frameworks like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework once it joins to start to set standards within the region that help the members of the Indo-Pacific Framework to have a smaller environmental footprint, which again is aligned with Canadian domestic priorities about climate change and improving the environment, but also contributing to combating global climate change. I think that the Japanese government is relieved that Canada has released an Indo-Pacific strategy. I think that they see that Canada has prioritized and understood clearly that China is a global disruptor, and that Canada needs to work with like-minded countries to ensure that a rules-based order continues to be the basis for how we engage in international affairs in the region. I think that the focus on resilience, the focus on security, focus on trade, the sustained presence through through having an office in Singapore. These are all very positive elements for Japan when looking at Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. I also think that the way Canada has not only focused on in Northeast Asia, but included Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands in, I think, really interesting formulas, and as well as Taiwan, resonate with Japan's long-standing approach to the region, which is through economic engagement, developmental policy, and building strong relationships that support a rules-based order. So I think there's a lot to like in Japan and amongst many countries within the region. But ultimately now we need to see how the resources are going to be spent, and will they have a sustained and meaningful approach. And I think also we have to see if this strategy survives beyond Trudeau government, but is continued with whatever the next government is. And I think these are important things that Japan is looking for, but also other countries in the region.
Do you think the way the strategy as articulated falls in line with the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific?
Yes, and I think I was relieved. I think that in some sectors or some quarters of Canadian academia and the think tank world, they have basically said that the idea of a free and open and like-minded countries, a free and open Indo-Pacific and like-minded countries, isn't something that Canada should be advocating for. I disagree with this. Canadians' post-World War II prosperity, its peace and stability, its democratic system, its economic engagement in the region has all been based on a rules-based order that was founded and supported by like-minded countries. It's at risk as China and Russia continue to deepen their alignment. They have said explicitly that they would like to weaken international institutions. They talk about redefining what democracy is. They talk about redefining what human rights is. They are very much interested in diluting ideas about rule of law and civil society. In the Chinese context, actually, Xi Jinping said himself in a document called Document 9 that was released back in 2014, I believe, that these were things that the Chinese government should fiercely resist in the domestic context of China. So, in a sense, the document that the Canadians released has explicitly said that Canada will defend its democratic traditions, human rights, rule of law, And I think that this is really, really critical, and we need to always put that front and center of how we think about the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, I was relieved that the document also said that we need to find bridges or crosswalks to work with China on climate change, on transnational security, or non-traditional security challenges, such as the next pandemic. So I think there's a lot to like. And again, I was pleasantly surprised that this was front and center of the document.
Do you think the strategy addresses China's rapid and dramatic modernization of the PLA, along with Beijing's increasingly assertive behavior in the Indo-Pacific?
So Canada can't do this alone, and this is why I think the document highlighted the importance of partnerships with Japan, with South Korea, with the United States. It talked a lot about Taiwan and how that the status quo across the Taiwan Strait is critical for stability in the region, but it really focused on partnerships. And I think a country like Canada needs to build active partnerships to have a sustainable diplomatic footprint within the region. I would say that perhaps one area that I would think that needs a little bit more focus is really rethinking what it means to be a middle power in the 21st century. And does this mean a normative approach to how we engage in issues within the Indo-Pacific, or does it mean a more pragmatic, realist approach where we have different formulas of cooperation, where we work with middle powers to influence and shape the behavior of course, our long-term and closest friend, the United States, but also to work together with middle powers to protect against economic coercion, cyber intrusions, and the weakening of international institutions. So this is an area as well that I think is something that we should have included in the document, a rethink about what our middle power identity and diplomacy should look like.
Minister Anita Anand recently said that we need to challenge China when we ought to and cooperate when we must. Could you explain what areas are important to challenge China on and what the most important areas of cooperation may be?
Well, I think Mr. Anand is correct. And we need to put in the context. China is our second largest trading partner. And this is not likely to change unless we have a lot more economic cooperation with South Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, India, and others. And I think that the strategy does outline a diversification path to selectively diversify away from China. But at the same time, we should be very clear that we benefit from trade with China. In fact, during the COVID pandemic, our trade increased with China. This is despite record unfavorable ratings, despite the hostage diplomacy arresting both Michael Spavro and Michael Kovrig, and despite increasingly assertive behavior. So we do benefit from this economic relationship with China, but at the same time, we should be very clear-eyed that what happens in the Indo-Pacific region, and here I'm thinking across the Taiwan Straits, friction or kinetic conflict across the Taiwan Straits would affect technology supply chains, semiconductor supply chains that employ hundreds of thousands of Canadians. Those Honda factories and those Toyota factories and other Japanese companies that are based in Ontario, they use semiconductors that are produced in this region. So there's a direct link. And the Taiwan Straits is a critical area that I think Minister Anand is thinking about. We also have the South China Sea with artificial islands that have been built and militarized, which is creating challenges in terms of stable sea lines of communications in the South China Sea. We saw this summer military drills in and around Taiwan. So definitely China is part of the challenge. But don't forget, there's North Korea with weapons of mass production expansion. And this has the potential to reshape the region's security environment. And here Canada has an important role in enforcing sanctions on North Korea to ensure that its economy continues to not benefit from evading sanctions. We also have concerns in the Himalayan plateau between the Chinese and the Indians. So there's a lot on the table, and we need to be clear-eyed about those challenges, but we should also be clear-eyed about, I think, China's gray zone tactics within the region, its lawfare operations to, erode away sovereignty claims of islands and territories by the Japanese and other parts of the region. And we should also be aware of the active use of cyberspace and political influence operations in the region and at home, and how this can erode away and weaken our democratic system in a way that is not in the interests of Canada.